single fold bias binder for the Baby Lock Jazz 2 is one of those attachments that you will certainly fall in love with once you start using it. This attachment is available in 2 sizes, 28 and 40. And what this attachment does is it actually encases or covers a fabric edge or a raw edge. This is the smaller size, 28, and this is the larger size, and this is 40 millimeter. So how this attachment works is that you'll see that there's a guide or an opening. This is the opening where you're going to insert your fabric strip. That fabric strip can either be cut on the bias or it can be cut on the straight of grain. As the strip travels through, it's going to travel through this guide, and that guide is going to actually fold that raw edge in. On the back side, that's going to be flat, meaning your fabric strip is going to be flat. That's where you maybe want to use a bias strip so that your fabric doesn't fray or unravel when the strip is attached. So I'm going to insert my fabric strip that I have cut. Mine is actually cut on the bias. And this time I cut this strip 1 inch. The size of this strip is going to depend upon the fabric you're using for your bias strip. So you might find that your strip might be 1 inch and 1/8. You might find it might be 1 inch. The key is that you always cut your strip and test that strip. Now I have found that with cotton fabrics, I actually starch my fabric piece before I even cut, whether it's a straight of grain strip or a bias strip. So I've now inserted that strip into my guide, and I use either a pair of scissors or a stiletto just to guide the fabric through the guide. Now you can see a couple things are going on here. I have a roll on my fabric here, which I want. I want that fabric as it's coming from this position out to roll. What that roll does is it turns under in that coil. On the back side, you'll see the fabric is flat. That's the reason I use, or is suggested to use, a bias strip, because that's not going to ravel when it is touched against your skin or touched against anything. Now, we have this open scale, open sliding scale, and what this allows me to do is to position this fabric edge closer to my needle. So I'm going to place 1 fixing screw in position, and I'm just going to slide that probably almost to the end, and I'm going to tighten that screw, place my 2nd screw into position just to hold that. Now I'm going to pull my bias strip a little further back so that it actually sits underneath the presser foot. And what that does is that kind of flattens out that bias strip so that I can see, or that fabric strip, so I can see where my needle is hitting. I'm going to use that needle down position, and I can see I'm a little too far to the right. So I'm going to take my needle out of the fabric and raise my presser foot, and I'm going to slide back to my right just a little bit on this guide. Now I am using the straight stitch, and I have a stitch length of, I'm going to say, about 2.5, and my needle position is in that center position. Let's take a look and let's see how this looks. And that looks pretty good. So I'm going to put the 2nd screw in place, and we'll move on to the next step. So if we look at the platform on the attachment, you'll notice that there's a groove that sits underneath where that fabric strip is being turned under or coiled. That's actually where I'm going to place my fabric edge. Your fabric's going to sit right side up, and as I slide it in, you can see that that's sitting in position right there. And now my fabric edge is in between the fabric that's being coiled or turned and my flat edge on the back side. Presser foot is lowered, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch. And you can see that that bias strip is grabbing my main fabric or my base fabric. And I look at this as almost a two-handed operation. And by two-handed operation, I mean I have one hand hanging on to my base fabric here, and I have another hand hanging onto the bias strip. And it's not hanging onto, it's just acting as a guide. I don't want to put any tension on this strip because it will affect how it stitches out as it comes out of that guide. Now, as I'm stitching, I'm found that by placing my base fabric in there, that it has shifted my bias strip a little bit so that my needle is really close to that folded edge. And you'll find that that every time you add a piece of fabric or place a piece of fabric in there that you might have to make a slight adjustment. So we're going to make sure that the needle is out of the fabric. We're going to raise that presser foot. We're going to loosen that screw, and we're just going to slide it over a little bit. And that's why it's so important to always test before you move on to your final project. So when I'm looking at the back side of my bias being attached, or my fabric strip being attached, I think that stitching is a little close to that fabric edge. I actually want to move it a little further into the body of the fabric strip. So I'm going to take my needle out of the fabric and I'm going to raise my presser foot. Now, I've gotten to the end of this guide, meaning that loop, that sliding scale that I had, I'm at the end. So how do I move that over a little bit more? So what I'm going to do is loosen that screw, and I'm going to put it in the second position. And now what that allows me to do is that allows me to slide this attachment a little further to the left. So again, what I've done is I've taken that screw out of that last position, I've placed it in the second, and now I can position my needle a little further into or past that fabric edge for a position that I prefer my needle to be when I'm attaching this fabric strip to my fabric base. So now I'm going to test it and see, okay, and that's exactly where I want it, so I know I can finish this entire piece. And again, I'm always making sure that that fabric edge is up against that guide, and I'm always making sure that that fabric is coiling as I'm stitching and that it's coming out folded from the tip of that coil. And then I'm just going to stitch off of my fabric, and I could continue to stitch this entire fabric strip, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to cut that fabric strip. I'll just stitch to the end, needle out of the fabric, raise my presser foot, trim, and then let's take a look at our beautifully bound edge. That's really, really attractive. And you can see the difference between how close it is just when I moved away. I think that that's a more stunning look for myself. You may like this edge, but I think that that is a much prettier edge. And then on the back side, it's just as beautiful. So that was using the single fold bias binder on denim. Let's do the same technique and let's attach this fabric strip to a cotton fabric. We're going to load that. Again, I always slide that fabric strip underneath the presser foot and past the presser foot, lower the presser foot, and I take a couple of stitches to get it started just to make sure that that needle is sitting in the correct position, or the position I'm looking for. Again, I might need to adjust that based on my base fabric. My base fabric goes wrong side down on the platform. I slide my fabric edge up to that guide that sits right next to the platform, and I slide it into that opening it's created by the coil. Slide it up into the bias or the fabric strip, and now I'm going to stitch. And as I'm stitching, I'm always making sure that this fabric, my base fabric, doesn't slide. If this base fabric slides to the left, it's not going to be caught in the fabric strip or the fabric roll and not caught by the stitching. Again, the other thing I always watch is to make sure that that fabric is coiling in that coil. Then I know that it's going to roll or be rolled underneath and caught by the straight stitch. We're going to sew to the end. And this is where typically most of us will take our hands away and let the attachment finish, but I actually still keep my fingers here so that ensure that that fabric doesn't move out of position. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to clip my fabric and we'll take a look at our work. Oh, how pretty is that? I think that is a really nice, clean finish for any type of project you're working on. I've actually used this in garments. I've done it in the round. The other thing that I've done is actually placed it along the fabric edge, and then I've seamed my fabric for a beautiful hem finish. The final piece of fabric I'd like to play with is actually a knit. And in this case, what I did was I actually seamed or have a seam. So I'm going to remove that bias strip from the attachment because I'm going to need one a little bit longer. And this way you can see the loading process again. So it goes in the guide, and this is where I use either stiletto, pair of scissors. I've oftentimes used a little Allen screwdriver. I'm just kind of sliding or pushing it through that coil, and once it comes out, I'm going to pull that back underneath the presser foot, lower my presser foot. Now, this has got a seam in it, so I want to show you how easily this attachment will go over a seam, encasing that seam along with that fabric edge. So again, I slid my fabric onto the platform, wrong side down. Again, that fabric edge is slid up to the guide. Now this is a knit, so this will tend to want to pull on you a little bit, so you do need to pay attention to keeping, or make sure that you keep that fabric edge in position. Now in looking at this, because of the the cotton was very thin, this knit has a little bit of loft to it, and I can already see my needle might be too close to that fabric edge. So I'm actually going to raise my needle out of the fabric, raise my presser foot, and I'm going to slide the attachment over just a little bit to the left. So what it does is it pulls the needle a little further away from that edge. Okay, so I'm coming to the point where my seam is going to start entering that guide. What I want to make sure is that my seam is laying flat. I actually make sure I press my seams open, but it needs to be flat as it goes into the attachment, so we need to check and make sure that that's the case. And you can see now we're going over the seam, and it handled it beautifully. And then we'll sew to the ends. And you can continue to sew this strip out, because I have actually used this in other projects. You can use it as a great kind of inserted piping, because you have this great flat edge that you can put into a garment, and then you have a great folded edge on the outside. So let's take a look at our work. Wow, I think that's really attractive. And then this is the back side. That's that seam, and you can see it stitched over that seam perfectly. This is an awesome attachment, and I think that it's one that you certainly want to add to your wish list. So this is the Baby Lock Jazz 2 using the single fold bias binder.